Hello, and welcome to another guide for Divinity at Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Medewi, who are quite a fantastic underdog faction. They are exceptionally interesting because they really resemble Egypt from Rome 1, if you've ever played that game. Otherwise, they look like a faction straight out of Total War Pharaoh. They essentially are the inheritors of Bronze Age Egyptian civilization in Rome too, and throughout Divinity and Impera, they come with some rather disciplined tribal infantry. However, as the game progresses, your units become increasingly outdated, and you have to struggle to perform against modern technology like 4x armor, the segmented armor of the Romans, as well as the incredible cavalry of the Parthians, making you an absolute underdog. Simultaneously, you have some rather interesting, really powerful tools that you can use to destroy the Ptolemaic Empire early on and become the overlords of Egypt, as it truly feels your destiny is. So let's go check out the start position for the Medewi, figure out how best to play it strategically, and then look at the roster of this rather rarely played, but very cool faction. So this is the start position for the Medewi, and the first thing that should become overwhelmingly apparent is that you are deep within the province of Ethiopia, which is rather defensible. It's right here on the southern extremity of the map, and you're surrounded by two of your, we could say, tribal adversaries here. They are the rival Egyptian kingdoms. Speaking of that, you are considered Egyptian culturally, which is very unique. However, the only other faction in the game that shares this with you are the Axumites right here. And given that you're going to destroy them quite early on, this particular cultural flavor to this faction won't help you at all. Throughout your campaign, you're mostly going to be conquering territories that have zero Egyptian culture on them, besides Aegyptos itself, of course. Outside of it, you're going to struggle to create long-lasting bonds with other factions solely because you don't have cultural affinity with anybody. Even the Axumites don't particularly like you. You can see that they have cultural aversion against you. So truly, diplomatically, the Medewi aren't particularly strong. Otherwise, when it comes to this starting province, it's rather depopulated. Like, to have only 20,000 people in the two AI-controlled settlements and a mere 25,000 in yours is quite poor. Although, as you can see, you do start out with 3,000 warriors, which isn't too bad. And for these two settlements, you also have quite a few warriors from the onset. So you will be able to have quite a decent early population from which to recruit your army from. But that's really the only thing here. When it comes to economics, you're going to struggle. Like, even once you control this entire province, it's going to take a while for it to really get going, to start growing population-wise, and become something that can actually help fuel your further expansion. So we'll go over the strategic ramifications of that first. But when it comes to your turn 1 moves, I wouldn't recommend getting any treaties with these two factions. In fact, they're very likely to declare war on you quite early on, and I'd say bring it. These two factions aren't particularly strong. They tend to recruit just hordes of levy spears, thinking that's going to be a competent army, and as long as you're able to recruit a couple of units from your warrior class, you should be able to best them in battle easily. Other than that, the first army that you spawn with does come with an elephant right from the onset, so that's going to prove a very decisive early game advantage, and if you can just leverage the power of this elephant unit, you should be able to rout their, undisciplined levy spears with ease, quickly take control of his province, and from there on, kind of mount an aggressive campaign against the Egyptians, which is what I'm going to recommend. Now, when it comes to your first army, you don't really have a ton of options, and that's because you don't have the technology to research your level 2 barrack. You should just, in my opinion, just go straight for military technology. I think that's probably best to do with the Medewi right from the beginning. You are going to have to research this, so that's 4 turns, plus this, a total of 8 turns to get the technology to upgrade to level 2, but it is so worth it, because for level 2, you already get access to a lot of your best units, like your Shotel swordsmen. These axemen are incredibly powerful. They're just such necessary units when it comes to the continuation of your campaign, but you should get it done right away. Besides that, your Ethiopian swordsmen, which are going to be a staple of your kind of low-tier infantry mainline, whenever you're going to struggle population-wise to recruit. These guys come from your third population class, so you'll totally rely on these guys. And in all honesty, this is a pretty solid low-tier swordsman, just relative to what's available in Divide et Impera. So I just highly recommend bringing plenty of these guys, unless you're going up against a power faction. But unfortunately, these guys are recruitable only with a level 2 settlement building, so you're going to have to wait a reasonable amount of time to get these guys, and you don't really have the time to spare. You should just start aggressing against your local opposition quite quickly. So amongst the units that you can recruit here, I'd probably just recommend making your first army out of a good amount of these bowmen. They are exceptionally strong. I think having 4 in your first army makes a lot of sense. Fill out your army with these macemen and these spearmen. Now the macemen just aren't particularly stable. They have a mere 8 armor and 9 melee defense, making them rather squishy. They're not going to be a reliable thing for holding a line. I mean, neither will these Levy spearmen, to be fair, but at least they're more defensively capable compared to the macemen. The real virtue of the macemen is that they have a powerful 26 charge bonus. That's crazy. That's akin to some of the more powerful shock infantry in the game. Not the absolute best, of course, but it's reasonable. It's competent. Very good for a Levy tier unit. So I think having 4 of these guys, particularly when going up against the mostly Levy armies of your early adversaries, makes a lot of sense. Having a decent mainline full of these guys would be good. And then I think bringing some of these Ethiopian spearmen, your more competent warrior class spearmen, will just give you that extra edge. And I'd recommend bringing 3 or 4 of them. Nothing that's going to absolutely uproot the warrior population in this first settlement, but just something to give you the edge. And I feel like this army composition works ideally when it comes to your first expansion. The other absolutely essential piece is recruiting a spy, because at least in all of the tests I ran, I was confronted with both of these opponents simultaneously, like they will just both declare war on you. So it's good to kind of use the spy to spy on, the one that you're not facing off against, just to make sure that they're not encroaching on your capital too much. Your capital should be able to hold out because, you do have a garrison, you do have walls, and their armies aren't going to be great. But it's always nice to be able to just keep an eye on your opponent. When it comes to mercenaries in this region, the bowmen are good, but honestly, you have access to fantastic bowmen, and these guys are just overpriced to maintain. Elephants are okay-ish. Your actual local elephant recruits are far more cost effective, but I guess you could get them, but they're way too expensive, especially considering you're not a wealthy faction in early game. These mercenary spear band, they give me very mixed feelings because their base morale is quite poor, and they have a mere 2 speed and no javelin, which is rather bad. Just across your army, you basically have 3 speed units, so these guys are going to be a bit of a drag. So I wouldn't super recommend you get them. Also, 166 to maintain them is rather expensive by Medewi standards. That's already akin to one of your warriors. So I wouldn't truly recommend getting these guys. You do have far better units you can recruit yourself, but it will accelerate the creation of your first army. So that's kind of a trade-off you have to evaluate and figure out whether it's something you're willing to strategically accept. It may also entertain just getting a wrestling arena to help with that public order right away. Again, there really isn't any diplomatic things we need to cover, but what we do want to cover is a long-term expansion strategy. Now, when it comes to taking over your initial province of Ethiopia, I wouldn't recommend sacking any of these cities or depleting the populations, because they will be essential to forming your armies later on. But then once you have those armies, the grand question is, where do you attack? And you truly have 2 options. Now, you could go and just make a crappy navy, just a troop transport type of thing. Just a general and a supply ship, and ferry your men across to Arabia. And the advantage of this is that the Arabs will very rarely actually attack you back in Ethiopia, so it's sort of a risk-free way of expanding, colloquially. Nothing is truly risk-free, but it's far less risky than the alternative, which is attacking Egypt itself. Also, your troops are desert resistant, so you won't have the same issues that, say, a Hellenic faction would have campaigning in this area. You won't suffer from desert attrition nearly as much. The other thing is that you do have far better infantry than Arabs do in early games, so you'll have an edge that way, although you have to watch out for their superior cavalry. And this area is rather rich. The only problem is that Arabian settlements are so far spread out, but I feel like progress will be somewhat lengthy. Like, it'll take a very long time for you to conquer any of these provinces wholly, but at least you won't really have any real danger when doing so. It's just pure profit. So it's safe, but kind of slow expansion. That's the way I would classify attacking the Arabs. Now, alternatively, you can make money very, very quickly and amass power very quickly if you attacked Egyptos, which is controlled by, of course, the Ptolemaic Empire. The problem, though, is that if you attack the Egyptians, they may muster a very powerful army and just come to subdue your pesky incursions. I mean, truly, you are akin to a raiding party that has become far more ambitious and is now treading into their territory. Now, if you do attack the Egyptians, you have to wait for your level 2 barrack to finish. You have to go recruit some better troops. This army I've constructed here, it will do so poorly against the Ptolemies. But the good thing is that once you do form your level 2 barrack, and I won't go into this into grand detail. I'll go over like the actual details of these troops once I go into more of a, of a roster overview. However, some of these troops are just exceptionally powerful melee fighters, and the Ptolemaic army is extremely deficient when it comes to early game melee options. With the exception of our Galatian mercenaries, they basically don't have any good early game melee troops. So you can readily exploit that weakness and, encircle and trump over the Macedonian phalanxes that the Ptolemies will most likely spam. And if you can achieve this type of tactical victory repeatedly, you can quite easily conquer all of Egypt, which is like the best province in Rome too, economically. And it's a very defensible province too. Admittedly, once you have Egypt, the Ptolemies will most likely come at you from both Libya and from Yehuda, but the Ptolemies are so overextended early game that they'll have challenges just keeping their territory down. Once they have lost Egypt and the extreme wealth it brings, their days are truly numbered, because they'll be fighting against the Seleucids in Syria. Probably, this one settlement they have here, Sida in Galatia, will probably cause them to have a war with like Pergamon and the Galatians simultaneously. They're already at war with Cyrene right here, so their Libyan settlements aren't truly safe either. So once you conquer Egypt, you might not even have to deal with the Egyptians en masse. In my trials, I only had to really win one decisive field battle against the Ptolemies before I had Egypt under my control. Egypt also is like 50% your culture already. So that makes it much easier to consolidate than any other province in the game. So what I really feel is that you should just attack Egypt. It is a bit of a risk if you're not a super experienced player. The Ptolemies might give you a run for your money once or twice, and you might have to restart your campaign. But ultimately, I think that's really the way to get the ball moving as the Medewi, and you want to expand as readily as possible, because going into late game, your army will be somewhat deficient. Still capable of winning, but just outdated in nature. So if you conquer Egypt right away, you can just expand as much as possible into early game and really take advantage of some of your better melee infantry. But that's it when it comes to the campaign overview. I think I have outlined a quite succinct strategy. So now let's look at the buffs and debuffs that the Medewi have as a faction. Alright everybody, so when it comes to the buffs and debuffs that the Medewi have, they are generally quite consequential, meaning that the buffs and debuffs that the Medewi possess will impact the way that you play your campaign. For some of these factions, the buffs and debuffs don't really incentivize any particular playstyle or decisions. They're just kind of neutral. But the buffs, in particular, for the Medewi, make some things very intelligent to do, while in my opinion, the debuff, Red Sea Rivalry, isn't really all that important, but I'll explain that soon. So when it comes to the culture-wide buffs that both the Medewi and of course the Mesaceli possess, you get Agrarian Wisdom, which is a plus 10% from agricultural buildings, which is in of itself quite good, considering that your faction exists in a desert. It will be especially important to make agricultural buildings that are quite productive. Also considering that you're a more barbaric faction, just in general, your economy will most likely be quite dependent on agricultural income. So this plus 10% is just a general boost, But of course, because you do start out with such a minor population in your home province, your economy will never be especially good in early game until you conquer Egypt or Arabia, until you start really expanding your territory. So subsequently, this won't really help you out in early game all that much, but in late game, you'll feel its bonus. But of course, this doesn't really make you want to do anything other than create some agricultural buildings. Now, Desert Warriors is actually consequential. Plus this 10, because this 10 plus morale for all units during battles in the desert is pretty huge. It's pretty massive. And considering that you're surrounded by desert and Gulf territories like Libya, Egyptus, Arabia, even Yehuda, you know, like Judea, Cyprus, Tyre, that province is quite deserty. Until you get to Syria, you don't start seeing very much grass. So because of this, it really kind of will incentivize for you to expand in those directions, and in particular, the Medewi don't have particularly well armored troops. So you're going to be quite dependent on morale to keep your guys in the battle, because a lot of them will die in infantry clashes. So subsequently, you're going to want to stick around in the deserts, and this really is going to make you kind of stick to your side of the map throughout your early expansion. And yeah, just keep you around Arabia, the Ethiopian peninsula, Egypt, of course, and into Libya itself. And maybe even, it may even incentivize expansion into Africa, because this plus 10% will make you want to stay in the desert. Now, when it comes to the Medewi specific incentives, you have lower costs for industry and religious buildings. And that's just generally a quality of life thing, not all too consequential, but, you know, considering that you're the only Egyptian cultured faction in the game outside of those minor factions in your home province that you will eliminate quite soon, you will obviously need to build a lot of religious buildings, and industry just comes about naturally. Whenever you have a settlement with like a resource or whatever, you're probably going to build up the industrial building for that resource. If it's just like a little thing, but not really crazy or anything. Increased commerce and industry, I mean, that just pairs well with the lower cost for industry and religious buildings. So yes, when you kind of combine the agrarian wisdom as well as the industry buff, you just get a general disposition towards making money. Like, that is so good. Like, it really does demonstrate that when it comes to the Medewi, you're going to want to build up your provinces. There truly is a grand benefit to it, because you can get wealthy quite easily from commerce or agricultural because of that. So this is a type of faction when you actually want to tend to your empire. You don't just want to let it rot and just continue to conquer more territories. No, you take care of what you have, because you can get incredibly wealthy if you actually invest properly, which is quite cool, right? It kind of makes you feel like you're actually building something of substance. Well, the Desert Warriors is going to kind of not necessarily control, because of course, you know, just because you don't have plus 10% in morale doesn't mean you can't win battles. The army of this faction is quite strong, but this will probably keep you fighting in the desert, particularly in early campaign when you might not have the most elite troops in your army. You know, this is going to keep your levies in the field for much longer. But anyway, the debuff. It's a moderate diplomatic penalty with Hellenic and Arabian cultures. Now, the reason why I don't think that this is particularly of import is for two reasons. One, the Arabian cultures, they aren't very aggressive, I find. Like, each and every single culture in Rome 2 has a different kind of diplomatic AI that controls whether they're willing to accept treaties or not, controls whether they are aggressive and attack factions often, or whether they don't do it too often. I find the barbarian factions, like the northern barbarians, we're talking about like the Gallic factions, the Germanic factions, they tend to be more aggressive. They don't really accept treaties unless it's really advantageous for them, and they will just declare war when you least expect it. The Arabian factions aren't really like that. I find them to be actually willing to accept peace treaties all the time, even when they declare war on you. They usually accept trade agreements, even if they don't like you too much. So because of that, even if you do have a moderate diplomatic penalty, I still feel like you can get what you want out of the Arabian cultures, although this might incentivize you to attack quite early on. Similarly, when it comes to this moderate diplomatic penalty of Hellenic factions, I mean, think about it. Like, what Hellenic factions exist within your orbit? Really just the Egyptians, and I guess you can say Cyrene in Libya, but that's kind of it. And, once you declare war on the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Egyptians, the Seleucids will probably like you quite a bit because they'll inevitably declare war on the Ptolemaic dynasty too. So because of that, you'll have this kind of mutual hatred of the Ptolemies with the Seleucids, so you could probably cultivate some sort of treaties with the Seleucids just based off of that. So this really only influences you to potentially go to war against the Ptolemies pretty early on. And while that is kind of significant, I mean, they are your massive neighbor to the north, your huge overdog neighbor, which is going to be quite difficult to subjugate, quite difficult to put down. But at the same time, this won't really have a huge impact on you once you put them down. But, this Desert Warrior plus his Red Sea rivalry, I do feel like this kind of controls the nature of your early game expansion quite a bit. And that's what I mean by these are important buffs and debuffs to consider. But in any case, I think that was explained reasonably well. Now let's go to the roster of the Medewi and see if they're strong or not, for this is an oddly Bronze Age-esque roster, so... and they're oddly powerful despite that, but still a bit of a unique one and challenging roster to use in battle. Alright guys, so this is the Medewi roster in all of its glory. And as you see here, it's not a particularly large roster. This makes perfect sense. It's not like the Medewi were some sort of great empire but stretched across many cultures and subsequently would have many fighting styles under their belt. No, this is the roster of a minor faction, albeit an incredibly unique minor faction, for this roster really does take the character of like a Bronze Age Egypt that's been adapted for the future, in a sense. This is a very tribalistic roster, meaning that the units in this roster are based upon tribal hierarchies with a very strong focus on kind of the nobles and warrior class, and it's far less on freedmen and lower classes that kind of encompass more of the lightly armed troops of the Medewi, which aren't as good. This roster does also have some Hellenic influences, but minor. Very minor. In fact, the phalanxes of the Medewi are incredibly lackluster, and I'll show you why later, but I wouldn't really recommend that you use them all that much. This roster does have some incredibly potent tools in it, but subsequently some glaring weaknesses that stops it from ever being considered something of like a power faction or anything like that. But simultaneously, the tools in this roster are both unique and very fun to use. During my testing and campaigning with this roster, I honestly found them really, really, really fun to play as because they're just unlike anything else in this game. And you really feel good winning with these guys because you really do get the feeling that you are playing with an army from a bygone era, taking on the successors of Alexander the Great and the Romans. And it's just so cool to put down modern, contemporary armies from that time of an army that's just antiquated by like almost, 1,000 years. It's so freaking cool. But in any case, when it comes to this roster, there's certain units you're going to want to bring in abundance, and none of these units are like useless or anything, but there's a couple of key units that are going to stand out for sure. But anyways, as we always do, let's start out with the generals, and for the Medewi you have 3 different generals. I really only recommend that you bring 2 of them, and I'll explain why. But the first general that you start out with is the Shielded Axeman. Now, when going along and testing the various axe units that are in Divide et Impera, I found that axe units are really never something you'd want to take as a main line. Very, very, very rarely. There's a couple of Eastern ones that are maybe a bit unique. However, ultimately, axe units always crumble as a main line when against mainline swordsmen in prolonged combat. And the reason why is they have very poor weapon damage, so in a long, drawn-out fight, they will eventually lose their actual combat stats of low melee attack and melee defense compared to, elite sword units. Just means that they don't block as often, they don't hit as often, and this like insane charge bonus that they have, it only influences the beginning of an engagement. So what you want to do with axes is you want to run them in and out of battle. kind of like as a second line, just charge them repeatedly into the enemy and pull them out. Make sure you have a sword unit that's actually engaging the enemy unit, and these guys will help you kind of just momentously break through the enemy main line, as long as they're melee infantry, of course. Also, when it comes to axe units, I found that the hierarchy when it comes to these units is that the Celtic ones are a little bit weaker compared to that of the Germanic ones. And this particular unit that you have here, the Shielded Axemen, they're just as good as any Germanic axe unit. So I have to give this unit a huge thumbs up. Like, this is an exceptionally strong axe unit. 30 armor is great for an axe unit. 30 charge bonus is absolutely crazy, considering that this unit also has a shield. Like, the good thing about axe units in this game is, unlike the like two-handed shock units, these guys can't get eviscerated by missiles, at least not nearly as easily. So this unit's stable when getting shot at, yet simultaneously they can provide excellent shock value because they have this insane charge bonus. 15 in armor penetration, that's better than you'd get on a Celtic one. And just in general, this unit is really, really strong. The other thing that's advantageous about this unit is that they're very nimble, very quick on their feet, with a solid 3 speed. The only complaint you could really have about this unit as an axe unit is that it doesn't have any javelins, you know. Theoretically, a better unit would have a nice volley of javelins to throw. So that's really the only weakness, but this unit's very cost effective. The only complaint that one could possibly make about this unit is that it comes from your noble class. It comes from your first population class. So you will have to expend some of those guys to make these guys, but subsequently, like, all of your generals come from that class, so you can't really avoid that. So when it comes to your infantry general, I'd recommend bringing this guy. Just keep him behind your main line, charge him in and out. I wouldn't really use your general along the flanks, because that's kind of risky. What if you get pelted by a skirmisher or routinely charged by enemy cavalry on the flanks? It's just not a good way for your general to go. So ultimately, I feel like behind your main line is the natural place for this guy, and he'll do well for you. Just remember the limitations of axe units. You know, this is not a unit to be kept in combat for long periods of time against anything fierce, or else they will get cut to ribbons. Like an Oathsworn or like a Praetorian, like an actual good sword unit, will demolish these guys in long term. These guys will only do well off the initial charge. You just want to keep on breaking them in and out, and they will make mincemeat of that unit that would otherwise destroy them. Now your next option is this Meroitic Royal Guard. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but to be fair, I don't think that this unit deserves very much respect, so I take that back. It doesn't need to be pronounced correctly at all. This is a really, really weak elite hoplite, and I'll just pull up another elite hoplite to demonstrate why this unit is so poor. I just want to pull up like a perfectly average elite hoplite, and that can be found in this Rhodian picked hoplite. You can see over here that this unit has 21 charge bonus and 26 weapon damage, as well as 38 armor. In contrast, this unit has 19 charge bonus, 2 less than the Rhodian, 2 less weapon damage at 24, and a paltry 30 armor. 30 armor is pathetic, man. For an elite hoplite, this is so base. Particularly because a regular hoplite, just your standard Rhodian hoplite, and nothing exceptional about this unit, it's the most generic hoplite in the game, this has 30 armor. So there's just nothing good about this unit, besides it does have 20 melee defense. It has 1 more melee defense than your standard elite hoplite, although your standard elite hoplite has 9 melee attacks, so you're just exchanging 1 combat stat point between the two, meaning that you don't even get like any net benefit from having higher melee defense at all. You're just giving up attack. This is just not a good elite hoplite, considering that it comes from your first population class. That just adds insult to injury. Also, across your roster, you have particularly nimble and fast units, like all of your skirmishers are generally 4 speed. Your melee infantry and your spearmen, they all have 3 speed, all of them. So to bring your phalanxes, which all have 2 speed and they're no faster than your standard Hellenic phalanx, I feel like that's just too cumbersome. You know, it's not going to allow your fighting style to show through, which is moving particularly quickly, being lighter armored than your average faction at this point, but being able to maneuver far quicker than them. You know, if you bring these bulky spearmen that, you know, they meander slowly towards the enemy and then are somewhat stagnant in the way that they hold, I just don't think that it's particularly fitting. I don't think that is advantageous at all. I think it'll kind of ruin the tactical flexibility that you otherwise have in a Medewi army. So I just don't think that they're worth bringing, and considering that they're also statistically worse, and they don't fit the fighting style too well, I just don't like them. Now, if you were like fighting a desperate defense, like, you know, you see an enemy army encroaching upon a minor settlement and you kind of make one of these guys hurriedly to bulk up the garrison, recruit some mercenaries and hold, but that could be a good application of this unit. It is nice to have for those cases, but outside of that, I would never bring them. Your first army in the game spawns of this unit, and I would just replace your general, find a good alternative just so you can bring an axeman or a cavalry unit. And speaking of the cavalry, you have these Muradic Royal Cavalry. Now, good thing is that this unit can be recruited just normally too, so you get to use them as much as you want. And truthfully, this unit is absolutely great. It has more or less like the regular combat stats that an elite melee cavalry would have. Like, you can find these combat stats repeated throughout the game. You know, any faction, like from the Iceni to the Arverdi to the Gite to, I think even like Roman cavalry units have units like this. This is kind of like the standard regular like competent elite cavalry unit that would come from your like noble class that's like good at melee but can also do a good charge in the rear. This is kind of a jack of all trades where, you know, it's not a super duper great shock cavalry because, you know, it only has 50 charge bonus. A good shock cavalry, like a dedicated shock cavalry, would have 60, but simultaneously its melee stats are competent enough to where if you find them, you find this unit in a protracted battle, they'll also do pretty well. Now, the thing about this unit is that it is lighter armored than your average unit of this type. You know, it only has 33 armor, which was similar to the unit that the Boii had. Like, their noble cavalry was also like strangely low armor. Not this one. It's the one that you can actually just recruit normally. Like, this one has 33 armor as well. But there's a key difference between this one, which is just a weaker noble cavalry that the Boii have to compensate for having rather good and effective infantry compared to their Celtic brethren, and this unit, because this unit has the same stats as that Boii unit, but it has 8 speed. It has full speed! Despite having great combat stats and, you know, reasonable armor, all things considered, it has 8 speed. This guy is as quick as any light cavalry, but they're a medium cavalry, which is insane. Now, truthfully, if they get into battle against a cavalry with heavier armor, and it's also like a noble unit from a faction with good cavalry, they'll probably lose in a drawn-out battle. But this 8 speed gives this unit so much capability when it comes to hunting down skirmishers, when it comes to fighting light infantry, when it comes to chasing in general, when it comes to maneuvering around your opponent and striking a decisive blow. You know, just all of the maneuverability that this unit obtains by having light armor and 8 speed is definitely worth the combat disadvantages it'll have. Just also recognize if you're up against like Parthian cavalry, this guy will probably struggle, like, you know, Parthian noble heavy cavalry, this guy will probably struggle in a long drawn out fight. You're gonna have to support it, you know, with your spearmen if you want it to stand a chance against such cavalry. But otherwise, you know, when you don't have to worry about that type of cavalry on the field, this guy will just perform excellently because his stats are great and his speed is just ludicrous. I haven't seen, at least I don't remember seeing, any other like cavalry with these stats and this speed. So just A+ unit for what it is. Great. Just again, recognize, just like with the Axeman, that this unit's somewhat precarious and has limitations because of his armor. You know, it's not the best melee fighter in the world, but for a unit of this speed, It'll be the best melee fighter in that category. Just glorious light cavalry. Now, when it comes to your melee infantry, you have a really, really solid roster. This is where I believe the Medewi shine. Like, it's going to be into melee infantry, into skirmishers, into cavalry, but the Medewi are most effective. And the melee infantry are probably the highlight between all of those, because truly, the melee infantry are great, but with one limitation: they're not the best armor. So in early game, they will dominate the field against most factions. However, as you progress into late game, you'll start having to use the units in tandem really, really well, because the units you're going to find on the other side of the field will be able to grind your men out. Now, when it comes to your melee infantry, the first 3 units here are more kind of like your lighter, levy tier style options, although this Ethiopian medium infantry does come from your warrior class. And then these are more of like the elite units. It's kind of the way like the class alliance. And you start your lower tier units off with these Neurotic Macemen. Now, I kind of went over this in the campaign map already, but these guys are all charge and nothing great afterwards. Like, these guys are essentially a low tier axe unit in every single way possible, you know. Melee attack and melee defense is not horrendous for a turn 1 unit. You know, a lot of factions have units like this, but, you know, 7 and 7 isn't great in any regard. It's just bad. But 26 charge bonus is excellent. Just objectively. And doing 13 armor penetration will always be strong. It doesn't matter when you use this unit. At 13 armor penetration will make these guys combat effective and cost effective, even against Roman legionaries, as long as you charge the Roman legionaries in the rear with these guys. And that saying, like, when it comes to this unit, you can always bring them. You can always bring them regardless of what stage in the campaign you are. Just understand that with only 39 morale and 8 armor, these guys are pretty flaky. They will break on you. Don't expect these guys to be overly resilient. Don't expect these guys to take a charge. Don't expect these guys to do well in a grind out fight. But they can provide a very cheap shock element to your army when you're trying to recruit an army and save money. So that's really the purpose of these guys. They are a cost-saving measure. You never want to have too many of these guys. You never want to use them as your main line, not even for your first army. That's not what these guys are for. But to have a levy tier, you know, a unit that recruits from your third population that's really cheap, which could just provide a good charge and just mince through enemy armor, leaving a strong enemy unit more or less combat ineffective for the rest of the battle, that's worth its weight in gold. Plus, these guys have 3 speed and come with a volley of javelins. So, you know, use these guys effectively if they do well for you. Use them incorrectly and get them charged by like a nice medium or heavy unit, and they'll run away like cowards. And that's really what you can expect from these guys. Now, your Ethiopian swordsmen, this is actually a solid unit. The only odd thing about them is that you have to recruit them from your settlement buildings. Either if you have like the main settlement in a province, like a walled city like Alexandria, or of course your starting city, it's from your tier 2 settlement building. If you're talking about a minor settlement, you have to get it up to tier 3. But these Ethiopian swordsmen are honestly good. Like, for an early game mainline, these guys are great. And I would compare them to like Thracian footmen, what kind of mainline unit you're going to use as the Drician kingdom in early game, like these guys. Except, in my opinion, these guys are better. For they have 21 weapon damage compared... Actually, no. Are they better? Are they better, or what? Did I just forget the stats? I mean, they have 2 more armor, but the Dricians also have more morale. 9 and 8 versus 9 and 6. Actually, you know what? They're dissimilar. They're dissimilar. I can't say that they're better than the Dricians. They have less melee defense. They have less morale, but they have more armor. I think that they both have 3 movement speed. And I think the same bonus, there's elephant and stuff like that. Same armor penetration. The Drician one is slightly better. But it's a similar style unit. A type that's going to do good armor penetration in melee, have reasonably strong combat stats for an early game sword unit, is very cheap. This unit costs under 100 to maintain unless you have a horrible general commanding with terrible debuffs. So ultimately, this is like a decent unit. Does good armor penetration, totally worth it to have as your main line in kind of a cheaply constructed army. Now, don't expect these guys to do anything outside of the early game. You will need to replace these guys with a more solid unit that actually has a backbone, you know, holding potential. But you could definitely make like an army with 8 of these guys in early game and just use them, you know, to dominate your regional neighbors, because like most of the armies around you have horrible melee infantry when it comes to your early campaign. Like the Egyptians don't have any melee infantry if I could compete with these guys in early game. Neither with the Libyans, to be honest. Not like the Arabs have great melee infantry, so these guys are actually perfectly sufficient and highly combat effective for the price. But going on to late game, they will be mercilessly outclassed, because 10 armor is not good, 36 base morale is not great. You know, 21 charge bonus remains pretty strong for a sword unit, but 21 weapon damage is bad. These combat stats are mediocre. You know, having this armor penetration is a luxury and will make these guys capable of killing regardless of what point of the campaign you are, if you get like a rear charge of these guys or whatever. But, you know, just this is not something you want to have as your main line going into late campaign. That'll be a massive hindrance for you. These medium infantry, these Ethiopian medium infantry, these are a direct upgrade. You unlock them with like your tier 2 infantry barrack, and they are definitely an upgrade, but deceptively, like they're not an upgrade for your Ethiopian swordsman. Like that's what I thought initially, but this is just an axe unit. This is just a weaker axe unit than your general. You can see it has 2 less charge, 1 less melee damage, 10 less armor, way less morale. You know, it gets a volley of javelins, and it does have more men in it. But this unit's so much more flaky that it's more risky to use. But at the same time, this unit comes from your second population class, while your shielded axemen, they come from your first population class. So that's the main trade-off that you have to evaluate here. Like, do you really want to use nobles? Because your nobles, as I'll cover later, are instrumental to recruit your cavalry. So you might not want to expend them for your melee infantry line, and that's when you'd bring these medium infantry, you know? At the end of the day, I guess these guys are basically a direct upgrade for your macemen. I feel like that's probably better, because just in every single stat, they do better than the macemen. They're just more expensive. So if you want to bring good axemen, these are the case. I mean, you know, you can have like 3 or 4 of them in an army max. Because they're not capable of being a mainline, they'll just crumble under the pressure. And they are just kind of a shock element. You know, you can't really justify having more than 4 of them in your army, because you need a mainline, you need skirmishers, you need all the other components filled out. But this is a very solid shock unit. It's just you have so many shock options that this is kind of the one that you bring if you don't want to spend too much money. That's the way that I would say it, because you have better options. Some of which are less safe, to be fair, but you have better options. Shielded Axemen we already went over. I do consider the Shielded Axemen to just be better than these Ethiopian medium infantry, because they'll just be so much more stable. Like, the Shielded Axemen actually have the Discipline trait, which is really important, because if your general dies, like, and you don't have a Discipline trait, your units are just going to start breaking really quickly. Sorry. And these medium infantry, they don't have the Discipline trait. So because of that, these guys are going to run pretty quickly if your general dies. So do consider that too. That is a pretty important little feature that these shielded axemen have over these guys. And of course, you can't compare them to the neurotic macemen, but it is cool that you kind of get 3 different options for axemen, you know? With every type of army you recruit, whether it's just a really cheap, cost-effective army, kind of a mid-tier army, or an elite army, you have an axeman option. But instead of bringing axemen, you could just bring a 2-handed shock unit. And that's what you have here, although we are still an axe unit. So perhaps I should have said, instead of an axeman, this is a 2-handed axe unit. And they are the Ethiopian axemen. Now, you get access to these guys pretty early on in the campaign. This comes from your tier 2 barrack, and they're absolutely crazy units. 3 speed. And just look at these stats. 30 armor, which is great for a shock unit with that uses a 2-handed weapon. This is great. It'll mean that they at least don't die to things as quickly. And then just elite combat stats. that are similar to elite Thracian units, similar to elite Dacian units, similar to the best of elite, you know, like Celtic swordmasters and stuff like that. Like, these are the stats that you want when it comes to a shock unit. Just superb unit. 46 charge, 25 weapon damage. You smash this into the front of a unit, doesn't matter what it is, what type of infantry it is, they'll cleave straight through. Particularly because this unit is an axe unit, so it poses a massive 13 armor penetrating damage, while also sporting 25 weapon damage. With this charge, it's just a beast. It'll eviscerate anything. Now, of course, because it is a two-handed axe unit, they're really weak to missiles. But you have really, really good archers as the Medewi. Insanely strong archers. So you're going to have the ability to protect these guys quite well if you engage in a prolonged skirmish with your opponent. So I honestly think that these guys are really good to bring with this army, but if you want a safer option, bring one of these shielded axe units. Perhaps bring 2 of these and 2 of these. That way you get a good balance. You get these guys from more of like frontal charge, and these guys from more of like a rear charge or something like that. You know, you just have so much good shock infantry here. Like, you have 4 shock infantry options. It's very rare to get this type of thing with a Divide et Impera faction. So that's what I'm saying. Like, these melee infantry is so unique, so cool. And shock infantry is capable of killing anything if you use them correctly, and you just have luck on your side and you don't get pelted or your charges just get blocked. So these guys will be absolutely lethal. But now let's look at the Shotel Swordsmen. These guys should compose of your main line. Now, this unit is a very, very odd infantry unit because it just has exceptional stats. Like, 17 melee attack is obscene, 22 charge bonus is better than the best swordsman in the game, better than your best Galatian swordsman. 32 weapon damage is better than your best Galatian swordsman, which is like the best barbarian swordsman. But this unit really does suffer when it comes to armor and morale, because these guys come from your second population class, so we don't have noble morale, and 25 armor is really, really low for like an elite sword unit. Now, unlike in base game, these guys don't have insane armor penetrating damage, so this guy is just like a raw fighter. Like, he doesn't have any special trick that's going to make him kill everything, like the armored Shotel warriors in Rome 2, which were just extremely overpowered. But this unit is exceptionally prolific, just exceptionally strong when it comes to melee combat. Like, whenever I tested these guys out and they just went like they barreled face first into an infantry unit, at first they were winning. But because of his low armor, like I'm talking about against like elite units, like the best barbarian swordsman, the best Roman swordsman, at first they'll win, but over time they'll just start getting ground down and lose. Now, they were able to beat, like, I'll just show you, like, a good example. Like, they could beat this Galatian chosen swordsman, but they can't beat the Galatian Thorax infantry. But they will leave the Thorax infantry on death's door. They'll leave it with, like, 50 men and wavering. So really, this is a really good unit, but you have to be wary of how squishy it is. Like, going into late game, these guys will need assistance to win the infantry fight against elite melee infantry if the other side has it. And that's where you're going to use your shock infantry to support them. Like, the best army you can make with the Medewi would have a main line of these guys, like say 6 of these, and I don't know, maybe like 2 of these and 2 of these as your infantry line. This would be nearly unstoppable. And you use the shock infantry to help your Shotel swordsmen overwhelm the enemy, for the Shotel swordsmen are exceptionally skilled warriors. Like, these base combat stats are unmatched. These guys are in some ancient Bronze Age voodoo magic, but their low armor and morale will ensure that they will lose against the best infantry in a prolonged combat because they just die too easily. So that's really my take with these guys, but together you just get such a unique, interesting, and fun roster, and all of these guys move at 3 speeds, so you can outmaneuver the enemy, just outrun them, and put them down. Now for spears, you don't have tons of options. Let's go over them quickly. Your Morotic Spearmen, these guys are just your standard Levy Spearmen, although this one's like a decent version of a Levy Spearman. Not like exceptional or anything, because an exceptional would have more melee attack or whatever, but this is a really good one because it has 8 armor. It has javelins. Some of them don't have javelins, so your free movement speed. And, 7 and 14 melee stat, like these melee stats, they are average. Not above average, but not under average. Perfectly average, while also possessing, reasonable armor and reasonable ammunition. Like, this is just a decent, levy spearman that's worth using. Even in your first army, as I covered, you might want to have like 4 of these guys or whatever. Going later into the game, if you're making like a cheap army, you might want to have a couple of these guys on the flanks to help out with the cavalry fight, that type of thing. That's something to use excessively because it is just a levy spearman, but still a good one. Your Ethiopian spearmen, they're an odd unit because they have like elite spear melee stats. Like, these melee stats are good. Plus 225 men means that they can leave quite a punch. These guys are great to have in your flanks. However, their sole weakness is really low armor. 15 armor is abysmal. It's lower than a Freyo spear. So going into late game, these guys will struggle in a grind out fight. However, in early game, they're perfectly capable. This is a very strong unit in early game. Just as you go later, this unit becomes purely a supportive unit, maybe to have 1 on each flanks, but, these melee stats never get old. Like, these melee stats are good throughout the whole game. It's just any unit with this low armor will have inherent limitations as you go on. Still has free speed, still very maneuverable. You have 1 on each flank, you won't be upset at any point in the campaign. The phalanxes as a whole for the Medewi are terrible. I just have to be completely clear. Like, all of these phalanxes are really like worse versions that you would have as a Hellenistic faction. And we start out with these Meroitic pikemen. Now, these guys, they don't have more speed, but they have horrendous stats. Like, 7 melee attack is so low, and in general, pikes already kill like very slowly, just like your base Macedonian pikemen don't kill very quickly. So to have even lower melee attack than your base Macedonian pike is such a bad thing. At the same time, this unit only has 20 armor, and your standard pike unit across factions has 35 armor. So 20 armor is absolutely abysmal. Also, the spears for this thing, like, it doesn't say it's a short pike phalanx, but I believe that it is. Because when I looked at the spears, I'm like, that's not very long. And the length of the spear determines whether the pike is actually effective or not. Of course, short pikes have their own kind of role as the more maneuverable pikemen that would excel against like melee infantry, like say the Romans and stuff. But this is not that type of unit. This is just an underpowered pike unit. It's just a bad pike unit. Now, any pike unit has its role in like a defensive context, but they're not good to have as a mainline. Also, they're recruitable from your second population class, which, your Shoto warriors come from your second population class. Your axemen come from that. Your, weaker single-handed axemen come from that. Your spearmen, which are good for flexibility and good for anti-cavalry, come from that. So to waste that population class on this pikeman is just criminal. It's such a bad pike unit, just across the board. The only good stat it does have is 14 melee defense, but, that's not particularly useful when your armor is so low, so more or less nullifies it. It's not faster than your standard pikeman, it's still just as unmaneuverable. So if it's just a weak pikeman akin to the Nile Spearmen of Rome 1, just not worth bringing. Your Red Sea Hoplites, they're not good either, because they just have worse stats than a basic hoplite, and a basic hoplite is the most ubiquitous unit in Rome 2. It's a unit that the most factions have, and to just have like a weaker version of that on this roster is not an asset. It has 1 less melee defense than your standard hoplite, making them worse in combat, and a total of 5 less armor as well. I believe that the base morale is also a little bit lower, but I'm not sure. Actually, no, base morale is the same, but still, it's just a weaker hoplite. It still comes from your second population class. And because these units move so slowly, they are such cumbersome units, but kind of just mess up that agility advantage that you generally have with your infantry and your cavalry. So I just wouldn't bring them. I think it's a stylistic mismatch for this army. We already covered your elite hoplite with the general. Like I said, it's a pretty bad elite hoplite, but it still is an elite hoplite. So if you're gonna bring any phalanxes, I bring these guys, but just spamming them is going to take up so much of your noble class that I wouldn't really recommend it. But it's really up to you if you want to use it. At least this would be a capable mainline, one capable of holding against many types of infantry, but at the same time, I wouldn't really recommend that you bring these guys ever. They're just not a great option. Now, moving on to your missile infantry, you actually do have several great options with this faction. Several great options with this faction. In fact, I would say that skirmishers are one of the main skills of this faction. You're going to start out with your cheap but cost-effective javelin throwing skirmisher. I mean, admittedly, there's nothing super special about this particular one. You know, it has slightly better than, you know, just the base stats for like a skirmisher. Slightly better than the base stats. It also can guerrilla deploy and stuff, but you know, 85 range and 21 missile damage. It's not like a bragging stat line, but it's okay. They do have 8 ammunition though, which I believe that a lot of skirmishers come with like 6. So that's the main asset. Obviously having 2 more javelins to throw is phenomenal. They also have pretty good melee defense, so they can hold themselves in melee combat somewhat. So for like a levy tier skirmisher, this unit's actually pretty good. They come from your 3rd population class, so there's use for them. But this archer is really the main event here. It is such a good archer for like a base archer. 150 men! So, you know, better than your original, than the typical 131, yet this unit has 175 range, which is crazy for a levy tier. You know, a lot of elite archers have this type of number. And 16 missile damage, so 1 more than your regular archer. Like, this is like a these are like semi-elite archer stats, yet they come from your 3rd population class, and they have 150 men. Now, they don't have good melee capabilities or anything like that. They don't have good armor. They have the typical 30 base morale. But just its shooting ability combined with more men already makes it such a deadly unit. Bring these in every every army. They won't disappoint. Such a good unit. Totally worth bringing. Now, the Kushite Painted Warriors. This is a shock unit. It's a shock unit of sorts. It can guerrilla deploy. And it has great missile damage. I mean, 90 range and 22 missile damage. Those are elite stats. Also 150 men. That's great. They come at you with axes, though. So the weapon damage is not exceptionally high. The armor penetration is really good. But like, I don't know, man. This unit, it's a bit weird. Because it doesn't scare your opponents. And it doesn't have great charge bonus at only 20. You know, this is not a bad charge bonus, but it's not great. Also, melee attack and melee defense leaves a lot to be desired. This is akin to like the worst axe units in the game. So this unit more or less replicates the worst axe units in the game. It's very light, it has only 1 armor, you know, it has good morale, so at least they can hold in combat for a while. But it's of questionable use, like, and you have so many good shock components that I'd almost feel like bringing this is kind of redundant. Like, you already can shock your opponents to smithereens with these guys, plus this comes from your warrior class, which you really need to save for your best infantry. So I wouldn't really recommend that you bring this unit into context of this army. I just don't think that they're great, especially because you have amazing archers. And speaking of amazing archers, if you want an upgrade, get your elite archers. Better range, even better missile damage, which is crazy. Believe it, they shoot faster too. 7 shots per minute. Yeah, they shoot a little bit faster. And this unit has some melee capability. Not amazing melee capability by any means, okay? Like, when you look at these stats, you don't think, oh my god, these guys are going to do great with 13 charge bonus and 23 weapon damage. But they can do some melee damage. You know, if you charge them into the rear of a unit, they'll at least fight. They'll fight okay. You know, it's just a more elite option over this one, but this one's perfectly capable of handling itself, plus it has more men than this one, so, you know, they can actually shoot more arrows in total if they get them all off and aren't targeted back. You know, amongst all of these units, the most cost-effective is by far the archers. This is just such a great unit. Just when you look at as many Rome 2 Divide et Impera factions as me, this is just such a rare unit, such an amazing unit. I would bring these all day. I would bring these guys if I'm trying to be a little bit extra and just making the best army I possibly can. This unit, you know, it's okay, but it almost is a little bit overkill for this faction just because of how many great shock elements you already have. But if you want to go to like a full shock army, this would find its way. And this is just if you're trying to make a cheap army, really. But just all along this like roster, just have amazing missile infantry. They all have a purpose, they're all cost effective enough. Just chef's kiss for these guys. Now, when it comes to your cavalry, each unit is good in its own way. You just have to figure out the context in which to use them. Now, your first unit, your Ethiopian Lancers, these guys are basically your cheap unit. It's just a really good, cost-effective, lower-tier cavalry. It comes from your 2nd population class. You know, it has good combat stats for a unit of this type. Very, like, citizen cavalry-esque. except it maybe has a bit lower armor than your typical like Hellenic citizen cav, but it has 90 men, which means that these guys will be more effective when it comes to charging the rear, more effective when it comes to eliminating skirmishers on the field. It also has 8 movement speed, which is crazy. Again, they give you this superior tactical flexibility that this faction is known for. So definitely this cavalry unit synergizes amazingly with the rest of your army. But if you're looking for an upgrade, you bring your Royal Cavalry, right? This is the same unit that you had as your general. And just as I mentioned before, it still has 8 movement speed, yet this unit's more disciplined. This unit comes with significantly better combat stats, better morale, better armor. Just overall, it's a much more stable unit. It's a unit that's more likely to perform. But this unit's cheaper and comes from your second population class, while your Royal Cavalry comes from your first. So it's just up to you to figure out the trade-off here, but both of these units are phenomenal. Such good cavalry units to have. Like, we're not the best cavalry in the game when it comes to like cavalry versus cavalry, but to have 8 movement speed on cavalry with, you know, this level of combat ability is such a luxury, guys. And just use these 2 units in abundance. They're so good. And so are your quilted cataphracts. This unit will demolish your typical melee cavalry if you get a good charge of these guys. And don't let the 6 speed fool you. This is about as fast as a 6 speed cavalry can have. You know, in Rome 2, like number represents a range. Like, you can fill up this bar a little bit less, and it'll still have 6 speed. So this unit's actually faster than your typical 6 speed. It's like almost 7 speed, which a cataphract being this fast is in of itself very uncharacteristic, because there's a lot of cataphracts, like this cataphract, which has 5 speed. So this is just a very fast unit for the genre it belongs in. But at the same time, this cataphract, it's kind of like a more balanced cataphract. Like, it's not going to be as offensively minded, but it's going to be better at surviving. And you know, it has good armor. It has great stats. I tested these guys out against a unit with like pretty similar stats as this, just like more armor. It wrecked it. Absolutely wrecked it. So this is like your top tier cavalry option. When you're willing to spend the most money, you bring a couple of these guys, they will just dumpster your enemies. It's a strong cataphract unit. Not the best cataphract. The Seleucids, Parthians, Armenians all have better cataphracts than this if you're willing to spend much more money. But this is a cheap cataphract unit. Like, if you look at the Seleucids, look how expensive these cataphracts are. Look how expensive they are. You know? This is just a good cataphract for the money. Now, moving to your missile cavalry, you have the Ethiopian light cavalry. These guys are pretty similar to the Nubians, just a little bit worse, but better armored. Like, worse in combat, but better armored, but still just as good at skirmishing. They're still incredibly fast, that type of thing. I mean, it's a good unit to have. It's just, you know, it's a very risky unit because of its low armor and low morale. You know, you have to micro these guys especially well if you want to get your value out of them. And what kind of makes me think that it's not a good idea to bring this unit into battle with this roster is because your shock cavalry, your melee cavalry also has 8 movement speed. You know, usually you bring these guys if you want to bring the fastest cavalry you can possible, because these guys are going to help you rout enemy skirmishers as well as do better in the skirmish. But it's like, when it comes to taking on enemy skirmishers, these guys are just as fast, but way more combat effective. And way less likely to die because they have better morale and better armor. So it's like, why would you bring these guys? If you want to have skirmish prowess, you have like some of the best lower tier archers in the game. You just bring these guys. I feel like this unit's kind of useless in the context of this roster, just because everything it does well, you have other options that'll do it better. Now, moving on to your chariot. This chariot's not as good as a Scythe chariot because they're a lot lighter. They die a lot easier. They don't kill troops nearly as well by running them over. This is like a light Egyptian chariot. Now, any chariot can be used effectively because they produce immense morale damage. And, you know, when you combine them with the shock elements of your army, you can create quite a punch. But they're also a risk because they can die quite quickly. if the enemy gets the right unit into them, so use them with caution, but, you know, chariots are always a risk, so use them if you want. Take the risk if you want. You can get access to these guys relatively easily through your cavalry barrack, so that's where you find them. Now, moving on to your African elephants. These are like some of the worst elephants in the game, but any elephant can be useful in the right hands. So if you want to deploy elephants, use them, get in your cavalry barrack. But mind you, these guys will perform especially poorly against like Indian elephants, against enemy elephants. They will be nothing but cowardly nuisances as they tread away from the field with their tusks pointed down, aimed at your own troops. So yeah, don't expect like great heroics with these guys, but you know, if you combine these guys with your shock infantry, you can produce such immense terror amongst your enemies that you can just maybe rout them in an instant. That's how you'd use these guys in the context of this army. But that's it! This army is agile. Very agile. Slightly armored, but packs quite a punch. Amazing archers, really cost-effective melee cavalry, and great melee infantry, particularly of the shock variant, as well as an excellent melee fighter, although one that's precariously armored, so you have to bail them out sometimes. That's the character of his army, and I love it. This is just such a cool roster, in my opinion. One that's unlike any in the game, yet one that you can use. You can definitely use it if you have the creativity for it. Because of that, you know, I do have to give these guys quite a few points. I do believe that this is a strong roster, because any roster capable of producing this much shock infantry has a chance in combat. Any roster with this good cavalry and this good missiles is strong. So overall, I'd give these guys a rating of 7 out of 10. I think I'm being pretty generous because I just like this faction a lot. You know, like, I just quickly realized they're one of my favorite factions in Divide et Impera because of how cool they are. Probably going to play a full campaign as these guys if I have to be honest. So, I might be a little biased here, but I think they're a 7 out of 10. I think in terms of how much you need to play this campaign, I'd highly recommend them because, again, this is like a Bronze Age Egypt in Rome 2, but not historically misplaced because it's the Nubian kingdom. It's the area that was not particularly touched by the rise of Hellenistic culture and stuff. And, you know, it's not like they don't use any modern technology. It's not like they're using bronze or anything. But, you know, they kind of have Egyptian culture with modern characteristics, if that makes sense, or contemporary characteristics. Because of that, I'd recommend you play them. There's no other faction like this in the game. So I think another 7 out of 10. You don't especially have to or anything like that, but I just think because it's a super unique faction, they're worth a try. They're definitely worth a try. I think you'll have fun. Particularly taking on Egypt in early game, like who else gets to do that other than the Seleucids? So it's just a cool start position. It's a cool faction. In terms of difficulty, I don't think we're an especially difficult faction. Having super strong melee infantry right from the beginning, but you can access, you know, pretty soon, just get your barrack up to level 2. By turn 20, you're going to have this unit that's capable of killing Roman legionaries. That's not a hard campaign, folks. That's not a hard campaign. Maybe economically it can be a little bit hard to get off the ground in your home province, but because of those buffs, like once you get an empire going, it's not a difficult faction economically. So I think this is just, you know, a little bit easier of an average faction. I wouldn't say this is like a super easy faction because they're not like militarily dominant like the Seleucids or anything. But, you know, in terms of difficulty, this is like a 4 out of 10. It's not super hard. It's below average in terms of difficulty. It's just not super easy either. It's not like you can run people over like Rome with this faction. So, 4 out of 10. If that's all I have to say when it comes to the Medewi. I really enjoyed looking at this faction. I think they're really cool, and I'd recommend that you play them. But that's all I have for now. See you in the next guide, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.